Welcome to the Disability and podcast, bringing together thoughtful discussion and debate. This month, Eleanor Lisney and Eric Wu are in conversation. The podcast is introduced by Disability Arts Online founding editor Colin Hambrook.
Hi, I'm delighted to welcome Eleanor Lisney, who's Disability Arts Online board member. She's also a co-founder of disabled women's collective Sisters of Frida and of Culture Access CIC. Eric Wu is BSc Nutrition and Dietetics student and mental health community organiser at King's College, London. Eleanor and Eric come together to discuss cultural identities within the East and Southeast Asian communities following a recent podcast they did called Between Nasi Goreng and Fried Rice. They reference Angry Asian Anonymous, AAA, a performance event they were involved in together at King's.
Hello, Eric, again.
Hello, Eleanor. How are you doing today?
I'm okay. Thank you for coming again. And this is continuation almost of a podcast we did together, a month ago?
Right
more?
about, yeah.
Yeah. And I was asked to do this, not just, I think, because I'm one of the directors of Disability Arts Online, but because Colin Hambrook thought it would be a good idea because of, I think he wanted more inclusivity, is that the word? More diversity in the work. And I think the DAO does quite a bit of diversity, but we aim to increase that. So in this podcast, I hope to mention a lot of things, if that's okay with you.
Yep, absolutely. Happy to be here.
And this is disability and in that podcast, I wouldn't say first podcast because that wasn't a DAO podcast. I never mentioned disability because we only talked about identity, and disability, being disabled, is very much part of my identity, and it has been for at least the past 20 years. Actually, we met when we did a performance together. Would you like to describe that performance while I look for that poem that
Yes.
I read in it?
Absolutely. The performance we did together was a piece of work called AAA. It was written by a few of us, including you contributed your poem as part of it. And it was a work in response to a co-production workshop done by Moongate Productions to foster creative pieces from East and Southeast Asian community members. And specifically the piece we wrote was quite a bit on challenging stereotypes and challenging perceptions that the outside world has about us. Whether it be our identity, whether it be our cultural upbringing, whether it be, how we present to the world. I think that was kind of the ethos of the piece, and allowing us to feel that when the world judges us, that we can feel angry, and that microaggressions, do actually have an effect on us, and we are allowed to express our anger or discontentment with the world judging us or placing us into neat little boxes.
Now, when I thought, about what to contribute, and thank you, Eric, because I think it was you who was very encouraging me joining. I thought it was quite important to bring in the fact that not only am I an East Asian, but also disabled. And I used this poem that I wrote, seems like ages ago. And I shall read it now. It's not a very long poem. It's titled A Young Man in White. Amidst the din and the fury of the storm, the acrid and steamy heat, the fat raindrops that fell in rivulets down gutters, the percussion as they hit on the cars and the roofs, the blaring horns, the cacophony of the scurrying pedestrians, bicycles, trishaw drivers, school children and traffic, all wending their way. I saw a young man in white under a wax umbrella, continuing unconcerned, calm, unhurried, as if in the reverie. He came into my vision like an exercise in Zen. Then he stooped under an awning into the depths of a herbalist's shop. I caught my breath, awed by this impression of serenity. Would he be caught in the same confusion morass, convinced in the jaundiced prejudice for the male child, assured in his chauvinistic pride of place? Would he believe in karma? Would he delegate disability to neuter me even more to a life without passion and love? That scar, still raw and red from childhood, denigrates my sense of womanhood, that I was 殘廢, useless, destined as one of life's debris. I have never sought the love of the men of my race, for fear of that image mirrored in their dark eyes, my self-esteem, fragile, slowly built abroad in the land of strangers. Now I catch myself daring to look at men and secretly weave a dream for a talisman to bind up those ancient wounds, for the girl child who would allow herself to be healed back into the fold. Written in 1997.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very powerful.
Yeah, and I thought this would be good here as well, because there's a lot of issues, for the want of a better word. I have written articles and stuff, and especially about being a disabled woman of color, or specifically as an East Asian, Southeast Asian. There is that perception being a woman as, there's certain roles to play, like, for example, wife, mother, very importantly. And if you're not married by a certain age, you're left on the shelf. Definitely, this Chinese perception. And disability added to it is double whammy, if I can say that. What are your thoughts on that?
So for me, it's an interesting question, because I grew up in a actually very matriarchal family. It was my grandmother who led the family, and then my mother and my aunt kind of led the families as well. In Chinese, the phrase 女强人, strong female individual, strong woman, kind of rings through and rings the tone of my family. So I always want to challenge these sort of gender norms and our societal norms that women belong in the household. I want to challenge these because I grew up with my mother working, earning a larger wage than my father, and I grew up with her, leading the household. I think it's definitely times are changing. As newer generations shift out, and especially younger people go into the workforce, we kind of realize that, you can have stay-at-home fathers, you can have men taking seemingly more feminine or pink-collar jobs in the industry. So I think it's slowly but surely changing, especially here in the West. I think it might take a little bit of a lag still in Asia, but still I've seen a lot of people around my age who are prioritizing work and prioritizing their careers over the traditional kind of mindset of, they need to get married, they need to settle down. In fact, they want to form their own individual lives first.
I think I agree with you in the case of career. But I think the patriarchal society confusion is still very much there. I know my daughter tells me that dramas are not always reflective of the society, and I watch a lot of Chinese dramas. And certainly a lot of the sort of scripts are still on the pressure on the woman to get married, especially if they approach the age of 30. And even if they are a CEO of a company, they still need a man to protect them for some reason, even if the man might not have a job. I don't understand that. But then I don't live in China. I never lived in China. But I think the confusion kind of thought of the man being more important or the son being more important is gradually sort of losing the sort of importance in the East Asian. I'm not so sure about the Southeast Asian might still also be the case.
Definitely in China, it's shifting towards less of the importance of the father, but more importance of the parents and the family. The mother and the father lead the family.
And the sort of gender, it may be less important. But I reflect on this myself because I'm much, much older than you. I remember it's certainly important because my name, Wa, it's a gender-neutral name. I think when my father thought of names, he was certainly hoping me to be male. He just added Choi, which is a very feminine name, to the Wa, which means that it is a girl's name. But a Wa is actually a male name, has a lot of male connotations to it. So, I can definitely sort of feel that. I don't know if my dad was disappointed when I was not male, but he left me that name anyway. When it comes back to the poem, I certainly had ambivalence towards sort of relationships, especially at that time when I left Malaysia, came to UK and became an undergrad. The sort of relationships being disabled was very much affecting me, even though I didn't realize it at that time. And hence, this is why I think I married an Englishman. But I met up with one of my alumni a few weeks ago. We haven't seen each other for 40 years. And he made the point that I was mixing with the Guaylo too much, in a sort of saying I was mixing with the foreigners, even though we were in the UK. I said at that time, I thought, since I was in the UK to study English literature, it made sense to mix with the natives, rather than mix with my own kind, so to speak. But later on reflection, I think that unconsciously I was scared, maybe, of that kind of the confusionism, the fact that I don't think that men of my own race would be attracted to me was very much there in my subconscious. And so ended up marrying an Englishman. And I think at that time I thought I didn't know if anybody else would ask me. So I said yes to the first man who asked me, sort of thing. And on reflection, I think if I wasn't disabled, probably I wouldn't have gotten married. Who knows what I would have done. But certainly wouldn't have got married and had children so young. However, thinking back, I mean, nowadays I have loads and loads of friends, girlfriends, who are also East Asian. And many of them have boyfriends or fiancés or get married to white men. And I stopped myself from giving advice because of my own experience, because my own experience is unique to me, and I don't know if that's a good thing. However, I don't have any thoughts about it from then. And not in the UK, but in America, I certainly found that men there are more open to disability than men here, and that is maybe not in the realm of this podcast to talk about that. I know when I was much younger, anyway, I was much confused, and I certainly never even thought of LGBT or any sexual orientation sort of thing, because I was too busy, first of all, studying, being a mother, being a wife, and then being a student again. I remember, because I went back to study in the US, and my children came to visit me. And I remember telling my daughter that I'd like to have a Jeep if I ever drove again. And she said, "But Mom, if you do that, people would think you're a dyke." Huh? I didn't even know she knew the word. And then she said, "It's okay, Mom. John and I, my children, we wouldn't mind if you are." At that time, it didn't even occur to me. So in a sort of really weird kind of way, maybe because we're focusing on the poem, I've sort of gone in a sort of very roundabout way of talking about sexuality and disability, and I think it's more than that. It's also our identities when it comes to how do we feel about ourselves, whether we're in the East Asian, Southeast Asian world, or whether we're here in the Western world. How does that fit in? I mean, how are we supposed to find ourselves orientated? What do you think?
I think it's challenging and confusing because we, at least for me, being in both the Eastern and Western worlds, we're told almost two conflicting things that clash together. When it comes to how they view, especially East and Southeast Asian men and women, as we are meek, we are humble, we are quiet. but at the same time, hypersexualized, often in the media. It's interesting how you can combat that, because if you don't fit into this perception, this stereotype that they have in their mind of you, then somehow I feel that it's my fault, that I sometimes might not fit into what they want. And it's weird, because it does affect my own perception of my own self-being and my own self-worth. But it's based off of what other people tell me is the right way to be, or the right way to project or act.
I think that hypersexuality thing, it's certainly very, very true. And I think I was pretty sheltered when I was when I was a mother and a wife in Strasbourg in France, because it was very much in a bubble. I was in the English-speaking world. And actually, I think when I was a child growing up in Malaysia, we didn't have any sex education or anything like that. It's not part of the curriculum. And then I went almost straight into university, and certainly that was the whole adventure of getting used to being a student. On top of that, being a disabled student, having to get used to the environment, how to get from A to B. And then I got married the week I graduated. Not a very wise thing to do. But, and then I almost then, very soon after that went to France. But I think it was in France that I understood, because it's much, much open in France, even though I didn't understand the language. But still, I was very much sheltered. As I said, my ex worked in a sort of semi-diplomatic circle. So in that sort of status, I certainly didn't meet people for my own sake, because it was almost meeting people because I didn't have a working life, so I didn't meet people. But when I went to the States, I found out that being an East Asian woman gives you a kind of different perspective, different status. I don't know, because you're from that world, Eric. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I mean, I felt like in my meetings as a student with other students, with other people there, it made me understand that being an Asian woman puts you on a kind of status. I don't know what kind of status. As you say, the sort of meek, hypersexualized, the sort of the bondage, that kind of stuff that comes up as soon as you put Asian women on the internet. Mm. For that, I didn't understand that. And certainly much, much more in America than in the UK. Maybe because by that time I've moved out the UK before the internet. And I was studying information science, so I was very much on the net, I suppose, because that was what I was studying and researching. And also that's where I learned, in fact, if I can say that, my identity as a disabled woman or as a disabled person, because it was in Austin, Texas, that I met disabled people activism, and I learned about it. So it was a whole mixture of learning about disability there, as well as being sensitized to sort of my East Asian identity. Speaking of it, it's made me sort of realize, and this is why I say that I only learn about these things in the eyes of, people from a different land, because I find, and I regret this very, very much, because I'm not literate in Chinese, so there's a huge part of me that doesn't understand my heritage. And so when I talked about, I only knew about what it means to be Asian woman, and how I felt about it was very much on the surface of learning to be Chinese, or being the Chinese or Asian child, which didn't grow up because I didn't have the privilege or the experience of Chinese literature as I did of English literature. Does that make sense to you?
We only have access to one side. Even for me, I learned Chinese, but I've never been able to access the literature that you're describing in Chinese literature, because for me as well, there's still the language barrier, where if I read it, I still don't understand it. There's also that cultural barrier, because like you said, I grew up in the US. I grew up in a different atmosphere. And so what you've mentioned here about how our identity shifts and the receptions of our identity shifts depending on what's our environment and what country we're in, for me, that was very true. My perception growing up as a Chinese American, growing up as Asian American in the US was very different. And my connection to being Chinese was very different than when I was in Singapore. And everyone around me was mostly Chinese. You saw Chinese literature and Chinese language and culture everywhere in Singapore. And alongside Malay and Indonesian, Malaysian, and South
Tamil.
Asian cultures, Tamil, exactly. All the cultures blended together, but it was very much more represented. And so I felt a very different connection to my Chinese side. And then coming here to the UK, where we're not as numerous in terms of representation, East and Southeast Asian, but when you say the word Asian here in the UK, very often I think South Asian, because that is what's predominantly has the predominant population here in the UK. But for me, my perception has changed as I change from culture to culture. That also affects me of how these different stereotypes have gone and changed. You mentioned in the US a little bit of a femme fatale. Am I correct?
Yeah, no, sort of Madame Butterfly.
Yeah.
Kind of, the courtesan who get left behind and mourn and, kill herself. That kind of self-sacrificing Eastern female that we only get in Western literature. I mean, it's not to say we only get in Western literature, but in the Eastern culture as well. So often the woman would kill herself rather than being raped or anything like that, because the stain on their owner is too much for them, which is kind of ridiculous, because I know when I was growing up, if you were raped or if you had sex with somebody, then for some reason you belong to the man. Doesn't matter who it is. you belong. And I could never understand it, even as a child. I grew up, my parents, I only spoke Cantonese with them, and it's my first language. And certainly I watched a lot of Hong Kong TV, and I listened to radio programs with my grandparents. But it's a sort of different type of literature that I had to access to than my access to English, because that's the language I studied in. It's because of colonialism. That's why I ended up speaking and writing and studying in English. It's not got that same type of depth or freedom, if you want to call it that. And I regret that. And I wish that I had studied, I could have studied the Tang poets and, you know, and all that. And I still try to, but I think I have lots to catch up, you know. But the sort of beauty of that heritage, it's also mixed up because I'm not mainland Chinese. And that so much of it is, I think it's not just our identities, but it's also our nationality. You know, whether I'm British, Malaysian, or you American, that has, you know, part to do with it. And I don't know how we negotiate that. I mean, I think it could be part of the fun.
I think it is. I think it's an ongoing negotiation. It's an ongoing kind of discovery, as I feel for me in my journey, being more comfortable with either side, or knowing how my connection to either side changes and adapts and evolves over time. I think it's very interesting because everyone, as you said, we all have very different identities, but we all also have very different meanings and connections. My meaning when I say I'm Chinese is different from if you say you're Chinese, because our cultures, our histories, our backgrounds are different, but it's all the same label that people use. And I think this sums up quite a bit of what we've maybe talked about today as well.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me, Eric.
Of course, it's been an absolute pleasure, Eleanor.
And I'm sure we'll see you again in many, many other events.
Absolutely. I'm sure this conversation is far from over as well.
Yeah, we will continue.
Yes.
And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. We do hope you've enjoyed this episode of Disability and. Our thanks to Eleanor Lisney and Eric Wu for an interesting and stimulating conversation. Please join us next month when Mind the Gap's associate producer Paul Wilshaw is chatting with actor Chris Hannon